Hundreds. There are hundreds of units in Total War Warhammer. How the hell can one human being be expected to memorize all of them and know who the hell's coming at them out on the battlefield? Well, that is hopefully what I'm going to help you to understand in this video. We'll learn how unit stats dictate a unit's role out on the battlefield. You'll then start to be able to see all the similarities between the units, and you'll realise that hey, a lot of these units are actually pretty much the same thing, and I'll deal with them in the same way, so I don't need to learn every single unit individually, I just need to learn them as groups. So, prepare your mind for a barrage of information and knowledge. And if I've said it once, I've said it 37 times. The more you know in Total War, the better a player you are. It's not about super fast reflexes, it's about knowing your unit's strengths and weaknesses and your enemy's strengths and weaknesses, and how they interact with each other and what you can do to control specific situations. So, ready up. So, first things first, before you can ever have any hope of understanding all the units, you need to be able to read a unit card. If you don't know how to do this, you can check out the first episode of my Why You Suck at Total War series where I go through it. I'll link that at the end of the video. So let's say you've just gone and done that and you've come back and now you know roughly how to read all the stats and what they mean. It then becomes a case of learning to identify stat combinations. Now, what the frick does that even mean? Let's use Longbeards as an example here. Take a look at these three stats: armor, leadership, and melee defense. When you see good amounts of all three of these stats together, it tells you that that unit has high endurance and is good at holding out. They won't rout quickly. They may make a great front line or are just good for buying you some time. Either way, they'll survive well and can tank out plenty of damage. But they'll probably come with a downside: low damage. The stat combination of melee attack, weapon strength, and charge bonus will tell you how good a unit is at dealing out damage. Now, Longbeards here aren't too bad against unarmored targets. They've got okay melee attack and weapon strength, but very little charge bonus, so they're not going to be churning their way through enemy front lines anytime soon. Nobody brings Longbeards along to try and do tons of damage to the enemy. They're trying to outlast the enemy and win a war of attrition. So, looking at how high and low certain stat combinations are, will tell you what kind of unit it is. So now you know how to read a holding unit, which should mean that when you take a look at all of these units, Spearmen, Chaos Warriors, Graveguard, Treekin, and Storm Vermin Sword and Shield, you'll notice that they all, for the most part, have that holy trinity of armor, leadership, and melee defense, meaning they'll survive pretty well against a lot of different units. You may notice certain differences though, like the Spearmen only have 40 armor, which isn't a great deal, but they do have a silver shield which helps them out, and the martial prowess ability gives them even more melee defense while above 50% health. The Graveguard only have 50 leadership, which is pretty low. But they don't rout and run away, they just crumble, so they will stick around a bit longer. The Treekin are a monstrous infantry, so they're again a little bit different from all the other three, but they can still fall into the same role as all the other units because they have that stat combination. But of course, the more money you spend, the better a unit you get. So Storm Vermin, Sword and Shield, while they can hold out really well, they can also do a good amount of damage to lightly armoured enemies, so they're not really low damage, unless they're trying to fight something with a lot of armour. But remember, a unit's role is the one that you assign it. High Elf Spearmen could be a good holding front line, or they can be your anti-large and protect your flanks. Chaos Warriors could be a good holding unit so that you can get some hammer and anvil with your cavalry. Or you could play more aggressive with them against a lightly armoured faction like the Beastmen. So those units are all kind of similar because they're all great at holding out and staying alive. So what of the other end of the spectrum? Let's take Savage Orc Biggins for example, one of my personal favourite units. As you can see, they've got a lot of melee attack, a lot of weapon strength, which is also anti-large, and a decent charge bonus. Not to mention the frenzy ability, which will make them do even more damage to start with. So this tells us that they can put out high damage potentially, making them a damage dealer. But very often these damage dealer units have a downside of low endurance. They have no armor, although they do have a little bit of a physical resistance, which definitely helps. Their leadership isn't great but isn't terrible, and their melee defense is pretty terrible. So their defenses aren't great, they can't stick around for a long time, they will take damage quite quickly. The opposite of the holding units like the Longbeards. So you've got to be careful with your damage dealer units as they sometimes can be quite fragile. If you can get them unscathed into the enemy frontline though, they could do good work for you. So there's a couple of the main stat combos that you may want to look out for when trying to identify what a unit's role is. And you can figure these out yourself, you've just got to pay attention to the unit cards and learn to read them. The more you do it, the better and quicker you're going to get. And like I say, it's just all about having the knowledge. Some other kinds of units and their roles: cheap melee. They've kind of got okay stats all across the board. They don't really excel at anything, they don't hold terribly well, they don't deal damage terribly well, but they do both things kind of okay. Cheap armor piercing. These units normally have pretty good damage output because of their armor piercing damage, but they lack in the defenses of course. Like a damage dealer unit, low melee defense and armor, sometimes low leadership as well. Flanking units. These are very often just damage dealer units that have good foot speed, so they're great at running around the side of a front line and getting behind them, using that foot speed to their advantage. Some units you'll pay an arm and a leg for, and they will be good everywhere. Phoenix Guard, an elite all-rounder. Lots of armor, lots of leadership, lots of melee attack, lots of melee defense, lots of weapon strength, which is armor piercing and anti-large, so they can potentially do good work on any kind of unit that they face. And this idea spans across all kinds of units. Cavalry, Wild Riders, low armor, low melee defense, high damage stats, guess what? They're a damage dealer. Monstrous Infantry. The same with Rat Ogres, low armor, low melee defense, but lots of weapon strength, which is armor piercing, good charge bonus, and decent melee attack while Frenzy is active. The Feral Carnosaur, an anti-large all-rounder. It's got the anti-large bonus so it can take out other monsters or cavalry or whatever, but it's got good stats everywhere and armor piercing damage so it can hurt all kinds of infantry as well. Another thing to recognize is when some units within the same army are just a progression of each other. Take Dwarf Warriors, Longbeards, and Ironbreakers. They're all basically the same unit. Good holding power, but not so much damage. And their important stats increase the more money you put in. Armor, 85, 100, 125. Leadership, 70, 80, 85. Melee defense, 40, 48, 68. You can see it's just increasing the more money we put into it. So they're just different tiers of units, bronze, silver, gold, if you like. And of course, you're getting the little extras along the way with the more money you spend, like the Old Grumbler's trait for the Longbeards, or the Blasting Charge for the Ironbreakers. Just another thing to keep in mind when you're learning the units and factions. So you can go ahead and pick your favourite faction and try to learn their army as best you can. Learn what the roles are of each of the units and how to use them. You'll then feel like you're going to crush the world with your newfound knowledge of your favourite faction. And then you realise, oh shit, I've got 14 other factions to learn. Because that matters just as much as knowing your own faction. You gotta know your enemies. Which I know sounds incredibly daunting. But fear not, there are shortcuts to this knowledge. The main one being that you have to realise that a lot of units are pretty much the same across all factions. Okay, examples. Swordsmen, Bleak Swords, Chaos Marauders, Orc Boys, Dryads, Clan Rats with Shields, Gorehood with Shields, Skeleton Warriors, Skink, Cohort. All basically the same unit. Cheap melee infantry. They all have the same role on the battlefield. Their stats are kind of average, they don't excel at dealing damage or holding out, but they can do kind of either a little bit. Some of them may be better than others, like Swordsmen might hold better than Clan Rats because they've got more leadership, but they're all kind of similar and they'll be used in the same way in an army. And they kind of put out a similar performance depending on who they're fighting, of course. But for the most part, if I see Swordsmen coming towards me on the Empire, I basically am seeing Bleak Swords coming towards me. It doesn't matter what faction I'm playing, I'm going to react the same to those two units because they are basically the same. Hopefully you get the idea. Let's do another one. Elite armor piercing anti-infantry. Hargoneth Executioners, Great Swords, Foot Squires, chosen with great weapons, Hoe Masters or Sword Masters of Hoeth, Black Orcs, Bestigor, Wildwood Rangers, Graveguard with great weapons, Hammerers, Marauder Champions, Plague Monk, Censer Bearers. All basically the same unit. Their role on the battlefield is to destroy all other infantry, whether it's missile, spear, melee, whoever. They want to get a hold of it and absolutely smash the crap out of them, because that is what they do best with all their armor piercing damage. Some of them may have less armor, some of them may have more melee attack or a better charge bonus, some of them may have crappy melee defense, but it doesn't really matter. You'll treat this unit exactly the same when you're using it or when you see it on the battlefield. Basically, you'll try not to get killed by it. You'll try and shoot it with missiles to get them down, you'll blast them with artillery, you'll charge them with cavalry, anything you can do to weaken them to stop them from destroying all your infantry. You treat them all the same. Doesn't really matter what their individual stats are or how different they are, just understand what their role is. Although still, the more knowledge the better. Getting to know all the little differences between these units can definitely help you out. And just another couple of groups that you could put together in your head: anti-large cavalry. Demigryphs with halberds, blood knights, fireborn, orc boy biggins, cold one spears, grail knights. All have an anti-large bonus, meaning they deal well with other cavalry, or even maybe some monsters. They're all kind of the same, maybe a little bit different in areas, but you're going to treat them the same when you see them on the battlefield. Anti-large single monster, Necrosphinx, Dragon Ogre Shaggoth, Feral Carnosaur, Hellpit Abomination, Terrorgeist, Charybdis. They're all kinda the same. They've all got anti-large bonuses, so they do well fighting other single monsters, maybe munching down on some monstrous infantry, getting a hold of a hero on a mount, or they can just charge around mashing up infantry left and right. Either way, you're going to deal with them the same way on the battlefield. You're going to try and shoot them with missiles, preferably armor-piercing ones. You may try and get anti-large units like spears on them. You may try and hit them with certain magics to try and get rid of them. What you won't do is send your swordsmen in to fight them, because that would be a terrible idea. You'll try not to send your cavalry in to fight them, unless they're anti-large maybe. You'll try and shoot them with artillery, because these are the best ways to deal with single large monsters. Doesn't matter that one looks like a T-Rex and one looks like a fucking disgusting pile of trash. That's the Hellpit. Sorry, Hellpit. You are not pretty. Hopefully, you get the idea and this makes some sense. It's just a case of grouping the units up in your head, preferably. There is no list of this, I'm just making these up. There's probably other ones that may be included in these little lists, but for the examples, you get the idea. The more you can get used to grouping these units up in your head and seeing them as all the same, the easier it will be to identify them and to know how to beat them, without having to memorize hundreds of different units. This is at least how I do it in my head. Maybe other people have different ways of memorizing it, I don't know. Let me know if you do, I'd be interested to know how people learn their units. And just for a couple of specific examples, let's say I've got a front line of Black Orcs, a very powerful armor-piercing anti-infantry unit. They're in that anti-infantry group. Now, let's say they're going to be confronted by a cheap melee unit. Empire Swordsmen, Bleak Swords, Chaos Marauders, doesn't matter which one, they're all going to be dealt with the same. The Black Orcs don't need to worry about them, basically. You can face them and they'll do just fine, taking on any of those three units. So if I'm in the heat of a battle and I'm the Black Orcs and I've got these Marauders charging towards me, I know I don't need to worry about them. Just get my attack orders in and then let them churn their way through them. They will win 100% of the time. Unless there's interference from magic or other units, of course, which there very often will be. But what if that front line was very different? What if it was Harganeth Executioners coming after my Black Orcs? Now the game changes. They are an armor-piercing anti-infantry just like the Black Orcs, so the Black Orcs could be in trouble now. They may win or lose, but even if they do win, they're not going to have much left in the tank after because they'll be thoroughly depleted from taking out Executioners. So this is a time when I may want to try and help my front line of Black Orcs out. I may want to cast some magic on them to buff them, debuff the enemy, just some magic damage, maybe some hammer and anvil with cavalry around the back if we can get that in, some kind of way to help them out and make this match more favourable for the Black Orcs. Same idea with cavalry. Let's say I've got some Empire Reichsguard, a strong cavalry but they don't have armor piercing damage and aren't anti-large. So if they're faced with one of those anti-large cavalries, Grail Knights, Blood Knights, maybe even some Cold One Spear Riders, well, they may want to be cautious of those cavalries because that anti-large bonus may allow them to put a lot of damage into the Reichsguard, if not to absolutely destroy them. So you may be wise to pull your Reichsguard back and try to get something else to deal with this cavalry, or at least to weaken them first with missiles, artillery, some spears. Don't let those Reichsguard take that fight. So hopefully that all makes some sense. Try to group the units up in your head, find similarities between them and realize that a lot of these units are actually pretty much the same damn thing. There's many different groups, so there's a lot of learning to do, but once you do get the hang of this, it'll make life a lot easier for understanding and identifying units within each different army. And one final thing to learn with all this is that there are hierarchies of power within all these different units that bear similarities and have the same role. Basically, who's the best and strongest unit in that group? Let's take those armor-piercing anti-infantry types. Great Swords, Harganeth Executioners, and Chosen with Great Weapons, all in the same group, all have the same role. But how can we tell who's the best? Well, we could look at all their stats, but that could take a while. What we can look at is the cost. If a unit is more expensive, it's usually better, of course. So if we had some Great Swords charging towards Chosen with Great Weapons, you can look at the two costs and go, oh wow, the Chosen cost a hell of a lot more, they're probably a lot better, they are probably going to beat the crap out of the Great Swords, and they will. So unit cost can dictate how good they are compared to other units in their group. Loosely, Not always will the more expensive win if two units are very similarly priced, but it's a good indicator. You could take foot squires who only cost 675, but they're in the same group as all of these units. They're Bretonia's version of an armor-piercing anti-infantry unit. They're not great because Bretonia doesn't have great infantry, but they're still the same role unit. So you can go ahead and compare the prices of units. This will give you an indication of who's the best unit in each of these groups. And with that, I shall conclude this here video. Hopefully this helps you make a little bit more sense of all the units and all the factions in Total War Warhammer. There is a lot, and there's going to get a lot more with Warhammer 3 coming along the way. If you're new and struggling with this, I'd say pick one faction and just try to learn that. Try to identify what roles each of the units in your favourite faction have. Then maybe pick a second faction and do exactly the same thing, and you'll probably start to notice the similarities between the two factions, whichever factions they are. They're all kind of similar in ways. Just take some attention to detail, and of course, knowledge. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the future.